Hey everyone, and welcome back. So, I thought probably the best way to handle the Jacksonian America episode is explain what really was going on that pushed Andrew Jackson into becoming president why and why our opinions have changed about Andrew Jackson and why everything's complicated when we kind of look at the populist tide and democratization tide, and where does Andrew Jackson fit in that? So, I think we probably should do a bit of background. So, the background of Jacksonian America is that you have the founding era, the American Revolution, and the constitutional era. Now, during the constitutional era, you have the Federalists, who were largely people who either are upper class or strive to be upper class, who, while understanding uh, that there does need to be some say by the American people, they wanted to be more affluent. And their power base was mostly in the New England states, with New York often being the swing state between Federalists and the soon to be rising party of Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. These were largely merchant class people who were either educated or who had access to education. Then you have the Democratic Republicans, who actually came from similar backgrounds as the Federalists, but who either had some qualms about the Constitution or the idea of a centralized government, or who saw themselves as part of the people. And these people included Jefferson and Monroe, and and their big issues were wanting to safeguard certain rights like freedom of the press and wanting to have expansion of democratic values. This also included freedom of religion, which will be very important. So, once you get past Adams and the issues of free press and issues of foreign policy between whether or not we should lean more towards our majority trade partner, which was Britain, versus our old revolutionary alliance with France. Then you have the War of 1812 under Madison, who saw himself as a successor to Jefferson. Now, while all this was going on, you had the Second Great Awakening, which, if you ever saw my previous videos, you understand whether or not there was actually a difference between the First and Second Great Awakening is kind of debatable. So, so with the Second Great Awakening, you have groups like the Methodists and Baptists and a bun and even Mormons who utilize a democratization of Christianity and used a sense of populism while also having a very top-down structure. they oftentimes expanded out west by using runners and had a more frontier attraction while while also demonizing education, which would be ironic because as they became more mainstream and more respectable, they also were able to implement educational reforms and gain some doctrines that institutionalized them, where they became went from being outsider underdogs, appealing to people who were starting to gain more rights post War of 1812, to in a lot of ways gaining traits the of the groups they demonize, like having seminaries top down, even harder line top down structures of that of the Episcopalians and Presbyterians. So you have this democratization of Christianity, you have the market revolution, and the rise of infrastructure and streamlining of communication. Alongside that, you start having expansion of markets thanks to the changes in infrastructure. You also have the cotton gin. You have areas like Baltimore who and the New England states who have trade. They also have a lot of the infrastructure for grain mills, textiles, and growth of manufacturing. You also have the shift from, while it wouldn't happen more until post Civil War, you also have the expansion of urban areas and also the rise of wage labor. And I highly recommend the book Scraping By, that does tackle the issue of like this change in American society where, especially in like border states that have this internal struggle of like the rise of wage labor and the fact that our expectations of society is changing. Alongside that, you have changing in election laws where formerly, while yes, it was largely upper class, but there were loopholes in some states' voting laws that, like in Rhode Island, women did have the right to vote in the first few American elections. But as this push for greater voting rights for men, it became the laws, while expanding the rights for voting to even poor white men, it also restricted rights if you were African Americans, women, and Native Americans. Which leads us to this issue of how we define democratization, which is democratization for who? Expansion of voting rights for who? And that is a very important question we need to look at we look at when we look at history, especially when we follow populist movements. Who's the audience for, and who are the laws directed at? Those are major questions throughout history, especially when you study populism. What are we actually looking at? And that is a very important lesson. So you have this change in America where you have democratization of Christianity, you have expansion of votes to a more populist leaning democratization base. You have changing voting rules and even changing in state legislatures. And alongside that, you have also, especially in this continuing debate over centralized banking, which leads us to the Bank of the United States, which is going to be complicated because nowadays we have the Federal Reserve System, but the Bank of the United States is a very complicated structure, and to be honest, how it worked is not as important as to the story outside of you have this structure that is semi privatized, semi public, and basically is meant to have the same role as the Bank of England in the UK. Honestly, the structure is very similar. So, anyway, its main role is to basically stabilize currency and basically bail out the US. We have we have a on again off again relationship with it, with debates over its necessity. Basically, it didn't get renewed under Madison, and then we fought the War of 1812 without having a centralized bank to stabilize our currency and and the bonds of the United States, which caused a giant crisis over resources and money, which is not great when you're fighting the world's greatest naval power at that time. Once the war's over, a new Bank of the United States is created, but there were issues between Madison to Jackson, which called into question the reliability and trustworthiness of the Bank of the United States, which is why when the Bank of the United States gets axed under Jackson, it actually had some popularity. Granted, it would cause a financial crash later, but that's kind of why when it didn't get renewed because of already issues of trustworthiness and this tide of populism, especially when a lot of people thought the Bank of the United States really only served the upper class and its investors, you kind of see why. Whether or not they were true, remember populism. Anyway, then with all these tides going on, the fact that when you get to the election between Jackson and John Quincy Adams, the fact that it was decided not based on a popular vote, which Jackson he had a plurality. The fact that it was decided by the legislature that voted for John Quincy Adams, which, if we were still dealing with even a Jeffersonian view of populism and view of government, that would have been fine. but we're talking about Jacksonian populism, which involved a democratization that included a lot of lower class men. So, well, lower class white men. So you have this tide that that by the next election, John Quincy lost and Jackson went became president no problem. And he started putting in a lot of the populist feelings, which was get axing, not renewing the Bank of the United States, expansion of lands into Native American territory, which is more of affirming again the populism and freedom of white men. And alongside that, it also allowed for expansion and strengthening of of the United States, which we need to remember Andrew Jackson came into the presidency based on the War of 1812, fights with the Seminoles, and defeating the Red Sticks. So alongside this, you a lot of people are like, well, if Andrew Jackson favored the southern states and had why and also had this view of freedom, what was the nullification crisis, aka when South Carolina tried threatened to secede during the Jacksonian presidency. We need to remember, while Andrew Jackson was a populist, he still wanted to be the one to define what populism was. He still came in with the understanding of, yes, we are giving states more control and rights, but it has to be under the purview of the federal government, and aka him. And because of that, the fact that Jackson threatened troops, he made so much focus on the supremacy clause is not actually that surprising because populism and this shift towards states during his presidency isn't necessarily contradictory when you still have this understanding of Jackson who still wanted things under the purview of him. So hence why we need to understand Jackson was a populist. What he actually claimed, what he actually said, what he actually did is defined as populism and democratization, but it still ends up with this understanding of power and and much like the democratization of American Christianity, in a lot of ways, for him to solidify what he did, he still had to keep parts that allowed him to his view to be institutionalized. So I know this isn't exactly the Jacksonian lesson you guys probably wanted. But understanding the tides that brought Andrew Jackson to power and how he solidified these trends is probably the best I can do to explain him. Anyway, thank you for listening.